Is this book Stephen King's magnum opus, or is it highly overrated? Hi, I am horror author and filmmaker Ryan Thomas Labie, and I am reading and reviewing all of Stephen King's books released in publication order. Stephen King was quoted for nearly 10 years as saying that he wanted to write an epic fantasy in the vein of The Lord of the Rings, but with an American setting. And instead of a hobbit as his hero, his protagonist would be a Texan named Stu Redman. And instead of this American fellowship dealing with the Dark Lord Sauron and his minions, they would face off against the Canadian tuxedo-wearing Randall Flagg. Stephen King's big boogeyman, Flagg has featured or has been alluded to across many of the author's titles, but was first introduced to the world in the later half of the 1970s. The story of The Stand follows a robust cast of characters who are spread across the world dealing with a deadly superflu outbreak nicknamed Captain Trips, and it is responsible for wiping out 99% of the world's population. Survivors find themselves in this post-apocalyptic dark fantasy world. They feel this call from a friendly 108-year-old woman, a black woman who's living in Nebraska named Mother Abigail Fremantle, whom the group believes has been called on specifically by God to lead them out of this apocalyptic world. But the group also feels a pull towards the darkness in the form of the dreams of a terrifying dark man who calls himself Randall Flagg. What follows is a saga of good and evil written by the man who would be responsible for giving us Pennywise only a decade later. The Stand was originally released in October of 1978 by Doubleday, but in a compromised form. King originally hoped to release the book in its original format as a 1,150-page tome. However, the publisher decided that a $12.95 hardback was about the most the market could bear from a King release, so they demanded the book be cut down substantially. The author reluctantly agreed to do the cuts himself so that no one else would touch his book, but he had always held a grudge for having to cut out nearly 400 pages of material from, this epic fantasy he was hoping to write. How The Stand was handled would be the final nail in the coffin of the relationship between the writer and the publisher that was already strained, but King had the last laugh because in 1990, The Stand, the complete and uncut edition, an updated version in which the author started at the beginning and updated all the dates and wrote some new material, was released. Upon its initial release, The Stand received critical acclaim. It was, praised. It was nominated for World's Fantasy Award for Best Novel in 1979. It was adapted into a television miniseries by ABC in 94 and again by Paramount in 2020. Marvel Comics even released a graphic novel adaptation in 2003, and the book was listed at number 53 on BBC's The Big Read poll. However, in recent years, the story has begun to be re-evaluated. In the decade since its publication, the epic has been criticized for including the magical Negro stereotype with its plot. Mother Abigail character has been identified as a character whose sole purpose is to help the white protagonist. It is a trope King has returned to and has used repeatedly in his stories, and it's kind of hard to unsee it or ignore it with 2023, vision and eyes. Just look at The Green Mile for another example. Following the 1-2 punch of The Shining and Salem's Lot, the release of The Stand cemented King as the master of horror and set the stage for the domination of both the literary horror scene as well as the cinema horror scene of the market during the entirety of the 1980s and early 1990s. While The Stand is an important work for sure, some still consider it his best work. It was a tome of a book that I couldn't put down when I first picked it up in middle school, but in my middle-aged, I found it very difficult to jump back in and to enjoy this story. I find myself resonating with many of the characters, and after experiencing the living through of a pandemic myself, it was a topic that I didn't particularly like revisiting. Maybe that's just me, maybe that's my own baggage that I'm bringing to the table, but regardless, it was a difficult read for me. I think The Stand is a King work that is good, and it does a great job of introducing you to the writer's style. Still, I would not be surprised if the coming years, people's view of this book does continue to fall, and maybe some of his underappreciated works like The Long Walk or Revival will start to rise in people's, appreciation. So after reading all 1,152 pages of The Stand, I was left asking myself,